She raised one finger, pressed the radio button once. That single click sent a shockwave through Nellis Air Force Base that would echo for years. Fighter pilots with thousands of combat hours froze mid-step. Crew chiefs who'd seen everything went pale, because what happened next proved something terrifying. The person who controls billion-dollar war machines doesn't need rank on their collar or wings on their chest. Sometimes they just need 8 seconds of silence and a badge nobody recognizes. This is the true story of the civilian who walked onto America's most secure flight line and brought the entire operation to its knees with nothing but quiet authority. And by the end, you'll understand why the most powerful people in any room are often the ones nobody sees coming. Major Rick Callahan had been flying combat missions for 11 years. He'd logged over 2,300 hours in cockpits, where one wrong move meant death, flown sorties over hostile territory that never made the evening news, and earned commendations from 3-star generals whose operations remained classified a decade later. He understood chain of command the way most people understood breathing. Automatic, essential, non-negotiable, which is exactly why the woman walking across the tarmac toward his F-22 Raptor made his brain short-circuit. She looked like she'd taken a wrong turn from a Pentagon budget meeting. Navy blazer that was professional, but unremarkable. Pressed slacks. Sensible heels that clicked against scorching Nevada concrete with the steady rhythm of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No styling that suggested she cared about making an impression, but it was the badge that really sold the illusion. Standard civilian government ID. White plastic rectangle with a barcode, magnetic strip, and a photo that could have been from any federal agency in Washington. The kind of credential that got you into administrative offices and conference rooms. The kind that got you politely escorted off a military flight line by armed security. Callahan wiped sweat from his forehead and glanced at his wingman, Lieutenant Jessica Torres, who was running through her POE flight checklist 30 yards away on an F-35 that cost more than a small hospital. Torres looked up, caught his eye, raised one eyebrow in an expression that communicated an entire conversation. Who the hell is that, and why isn't anyone stopping her? Hey, ma'am. The shout came from Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, a crew chief with 15 years of experience and exactly 0 patience for civilians wandering into restricted areas. He jogged toward her, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust, one hand already moving toward his radio to call security. This is a restricted flight zone. You can't be here without proper authorization and a military escort. The woman stopped at the yellow safety line painted on the concrete, the boundary that separated spectators from the controlled chaos of active aircraft operations. She didn't look flustered or embarrassed, didn't offer an apology or explanation. She just stood there, her eyes scanning the flight line with calm precision that made Callahan's instinct start screaming that something was very, very wrong with this picture, because she wasn't looking at the aircraft the way civilians looked at fighters, with awe or excitement or the slightly nervous energy of people who understood they were standing near machines designed to kill. She was assessing them. Her gaze moved methodically from his F-22 to Torres' F-35, then to the line of F-16s, being prepped for what the morning briefing had called routine training exercises. Her eyes tracked the positioning of fuel trucks, the flow patterns of ground crews, the specific external ordnance configurations that most visitors wouldn't even notice, let alone understand. Callahan felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Sergeant Webb was still talking, his voice taking on the carefully patient tone of someone who'd given this speech 100 times to last tourists and overconfident contractors. The visitor center is back through the main gate. Someone there can help you with whatever you need, but you absolutely cannot be on an active flight line without. She raised her radio. It was the same standard issue military communications device that every authorized person on the tarmac carried. Black, battered from use, with the specific frequency settings that connected to the base's operational network. Webb stopped mid-sentence, confusion flickering across his face because that radio shouldn't have been in her hands. Civilian personnel didn't get issued tactical communication equipment. Even high-level Pentagon officials, visiting for inspections, used escorted channels and monitored frequencies. She pressed the transmit button once. No words, no call sign, no identification protocol. Just a single deliberate click that lasted exactly 1.3 seconds before her thumb released, and the radio dropped back to her side. The effect was instantaneous. Every headset on the flight line went silent. Not the normal pause between transmissions, but the absolute air that preceded something significant. Callahan felt his hand instinctively move toward his own radio. Years of training making him check that his equipment was still functioning. Then the tower spoke. All ground personnel. Priority clearance now active. Clear primary flight path for Systems Authority. Repeat. Systems Authority has operational override. All section chiefs report compliance immediately. The words hit Callahan like a physical blow. Systems Authority. He'd heard the term exactly twice in his 11-year career. Once during a classified briefing that he'd needed 3 separate security clearances just to attend. Once in a conversation that had been immediately shut down by a colonel who'd looked genuinely frightened when the subject came up. It wasn't a rank, wasn't a position on any organizational chart he'd ever seen. It was something else entirely. Around him, the flight line transformed. Pilots who'd been casually checking their equipment snapped to attention with the automatic precision of people responding to a threat they couldn't see but definitely recognized. Crew chiefs stopped their conversations mid-word. Ground personnel who'd been lounging against equipment suddenly remembered they had urgent tasks that required their complete attention. Sergeant Webb had gone pale beneath his tan. The woman stepped across the yellow safety line with the same unhurried calm she'd shown while waiting. Her heels clicked against concrete as she walked directly toward Callahan's F-22, her eyes fixed on the external fuel tank configuration, with the focused intensity of someone analyzing a problem that needed immediate correction. Callahan stood frozen beside his aircraft, his mind trying to reconcile what he was seeing with every assumption he'd made about how military operations functioned. Tors had stopped pretending to check her instruments and was openly staring, her mouth slightly open. The woman stopped 3 feet from Callahan, close enough that he could see the details of her civilian badge. The photos showed the same calm, unremarkable face, but below the picture were lines of text and number, sequences that he'd never seen on standard government identification, authorization codes in formats that didn't match any system he recognized, clearance levels that went beyond the classifications he'd been trained to understand, and stamped at the bottom, almost invisible against the white plastic. A single designation that made his stomach drop. Sapphire Cardinal. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew enough to recognize that those 2 words represented access to information that lived so far above his security clearance that the gap couldn't be measured in normal terms. Your fuel configuration is wrong, she said. Her voice was quiet, matter of fact, carrying none of the authority that her presence now commanded. She could have been commenting on the weather. Ma'am. Callahan's voice came out rougher than he intended. She pointed at the external tanks mounted beneath his wings. Your mission brief says training exercise. Your ordnance load says something different. And your fuel tanks are configured for the training profile instead of your actual tasking. She glanced at the crew chief who'd been supervising the prep work, a master sergeant named Kowalski, who looked like he was trying to decide whether to be terrified or offended. Swap tank positions. Sequence 3 before 2. Update the fuel load to match classified parameters from Sapphire 8. Kowalski opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Callahan with an expression that begged for guidance. Callahan had none to give. Ma'am, I don't have any tasking called Sapphire 8 in my... She held up one finger, the same gesture she'd used before pressing her radio. Callahan's heads-up display, which had been showing his standard PI flight checklist, flickered. New data cascaded across his helmet screen. Mission parameters he'd never seen. Flight paths that took him nowhere near the training ranges listed in his morning briefing. Objectives that made his hands go cold despite the Nevada heat. Tor saw it too. Her voice crackled over the tactical frequency, pitched higher than her usual control tone. Ghost Rider to 1. Are you seeing this? Copy. To 2. Callahan forced his voice steady. Confirm you're receiving updated mission data. Confirmed. This is... Rick. This changes everything. The woman was already walking away, moving toward the next aircraft in line with the same purposeful stride. Behind her, Kowalski was frantically updating the fuel configuration, his crew moving with the urgent precision of people who had just realized they'd been preparing aircraft for the wrong mission entirely. Callahan watched her stop at Taurus F-35, watched her point at something on the weapons loadout, watched Taurus crew chief nod rapidly and immediately begin making adjustments. Sir. Callahan turned to find his own crew chief, a young airman named Patterson, staring at him with wide eyes. Sir, Who is that? It was the question everyone was asking. Whispered conversations rippled across the tarmac like a wave, each group of personnel trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. An older master sergeant, someone Callahan vaguely recognized from previous deployments, provided the answer in a voice that carried quiet certainty. That's a systems coordinator, Pentagon level, maybe higher than Pentagon. Patterson sounded skeptical. The master sergeant's laugh was short and entirely humorless. Son, Pentagon is where they have meetings and write policy papers. What you're looking at is someone who decides what actually happens. She doesn't fly the jets. She doesn't command the bases. She controls what FLIs when it FLIs, and what it does when it gets there. Patterson swallowed hard. Can she really override our mission briefings? She just did, didn't she? Callahan turned back to his aircraft, his mind racing through implications that kept expanding. The more he thought about them, every mission he'd ever flown had been planned by people he never saw. Orders that came through encrypted, channels from commanders whose names were usually classified. He'd always assumed the chain ended somewhere visible, a general, an admiral, someone with stars and ribbons and a face that appeared at press conferences. He'd been wrong. The chain ended with people like her, people who walked onto military bases carrying civilian badges and quiet authority that superseded every visible rank structure. People who could rewrite operational parameters with a single radio click and a few spoken words. People whose real power was measured in silence. By the time the morning's flight operations lifted off into cloudless Nevada sky, the story had already spread to every corner of Nellis Air Force Base. The civilian who'd commanded the flight line without commanding anything. The woman with a badge nobody recognized and authority that made colonels nervous. The silent correction that had revealed just how little most military personnel actually understood about who made the decisions that shaped their operations. In the pilot's ready room, conversations that had started as jokes died quickly when people realized nobody was laughing. Young lieutenants who'd been cocky about their security clearances discovered they had access to almost nothing that mattered. Senior officers who'd spent decades climbing the visible hierarchy confronted the uncomfortable reality that there was an entirely different structure operating above them, invisible and infinitely more powerful. Major Callahan completed his mission 6 hours later, returning to Nellis as the desert sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The tasking had been nothing like the training exercise he'd briefed, everything like the classified operation his updated parameters had described. He'd flown the profile perfectly, completed objectives he hadn't known existed 8 hours earlier, and he'd done it because someone with a civilian badge had looked at his aircraft and known instantly that something was wrong. He found her in Hangar 7 as evening maintenance crews were beginning their shifts. She was talking to a group of avionics technicians, pointing at diagnostic readouts on a laptop screen, making observations that had the senior tech nodding thoughtfully and taking notes. She was wearing the same navy blazer, same unremarkable civilian badge, but everything had changed in ways that couldn't be quantified or measured. When she finished with the technicians and turned to leave, she found Callahan waiting. He straightened instinctively, feeling like a cadet again despite his rank and experience. "Ma'am?" She stopped, regarded him with calm eyes that gave away nothing. "The mission parameters you provided," Callahan said carefully, choosing his words with the precision he used during classified briefings. "They were correct. Everything matched what we encountered." She nodded once, as if this was the expected outcome rather than something remarkable. "How did you know?" He couldn't stop himself from asking. "Our briefing was prepared by intelligence teams with access to satellite data and real-time reconnaissance. But you walked onto the flight line and saw something they missed. How?" For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement that his question deserved a response. "Because I see the whole picture, Major. Intelligence teams see their domain. Operations sees theirs. Command sees something else entirely. Everyone is optimizing for their piece of the puzzle." She gestured at the hangar around them, at the aircraft and equipment and personnel. "I see how all the pieces connect, where they conflict, what gets lost in the gaps between departments that don't talk to each other. And when you see something wrong, I fix it." It was the most straightforward answer imaginable, also the most terrifying when he thought about the implications. "How many people like you are there?" This time she did smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Few enough that we all know each other's names, enough that every major operation in this country has someone like me looking at it." She started to walk away, then paused and looked back. You did good work today, Major. The mission succeeded because you trusted information that contradicted everything you'd been told. That takes a particular kind of courage." Then she was gone, disappearing into the structured chaos of the evening shift, leaving Callahan standing alone with thoughts that would keep him awake for weeks. 3 months later, Callahan found himself in a classified briefing at the Pentagon, the kind of meeting where phones were confiscated at the door and the conference room was electronically sealed. A two-star general was explaining a coordination problem between Air Force operations and intelligence assets, their voices carrying the frustration of people who'd been fighting the same battle for years. Halfway through the presentation, a door opened that Callahan hadn't noticed before. No announcement, no introduction. She walked in wearing the same navy blazer, carrying a leather portfolio that looked exactly like the one she'd had at Nellis. The general stopped talking mid-sentence. Every person in the room sat up straighter, their attention shifting with the sudden totality of pilots responding to a threat warning. She set her portfolio on the table, opened it, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Your coordination problem doesn't exist," she said quietly. "You're trying to integrate systems that were never designed to work together. Stop forcing the integration. Redesign the data flow through Sapphire protocols, and the conflict resolves itself." The general stared at her. "That would require authorization from you. Have it." She slid the paper across the table, effective immediately. Then she picked up her portfolio and walked out, the entire interaction lasting less than 90 seconds. The general looked at the paper, his expression cycling through disbelief to resignation to something approaching relief. He glanced around the conference table, meeting the eyes of officers who'd been fighting this battle for months. Meeting adjourned. "We have work to do." As people filed out, Callahan found himself next to a Navy commander he vaguely recognized from joint operations briefings. The commander was shaking his head slowly, a wry smile on his face. "You know what the really scary part is," the commander said quietly. "What?" "She's not even the highest level. There are people above her that we'll never see, never know exist, making decisions that shape everything we do." He clapped Callahan on the shoulder. "Sleep well with that knowledge, Major." Callahan walked back to his temporary office in the Pentagon's labyrinthine corridors, his mind replaying every interaction he'd had with the woman whose name he still didn't know, the civilian badge that concealed authority that exceeded visible rank, the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly how much power she wielded, and the most unsettling realization of all, that everything he'd been trained to believe about chain of command and military hierarchy was simultaneously true and completely irrelevant, because the real decisions, the ones that actually mattered, were being made by people who moved through the system like ghosts, present but invisible, powerful but silent, essential but unknown. He thought about young airmen like Patterson, confidently discussing security, clearances and operational authority without understanding that they were describing the visible surface of an ocean whose depths they couldn't imagine. He thought about the master sergeant who'd known immediately what she represented, that quiet recognition born from years of seeing glimpses of systems most people never suspected existed. And he thought about her standing on the flight line at Nellis, raising one finger to her radio, pressing that single button, and watching an entire military base reorganize itself around her presence. No shouting, no displays of authority, no need for visible symbols of power, just silence that spoke louder than any order, just competence that superseded any rank, just the terrifying reality that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one nobody notices until it's too late to question their authority. If this story opened your eyes to how real power operates in the shadows, subscribe to Silent Warriors for more true stories of the people who control everything while remaining invisible. Hit that like button if you understand that quiet authority is the most dangerous kind, and share this with someone who thinks they understand how military command actually works, because they're about to learn something that changes everything. More stories of the people who run the world from the shadows coming soon. Stay silent, stay watching.